My name is Amy Consalvi, and I am the Director of Education and Visitor Services at the Museum of Russian Icons. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. It's hard to believe, especially on such a beautiful day, that we're quickly making our way through the month of November, and we're approaching the end of the year. We are so incredibly lucky that we were able to reopen our doors in July and remain open. But like most nonprofits and museums, we did take a big hit during our 4-month closure. So as you begin to make your year-end contributions, I would ask you to please consider donating to our annual appeal or purchasing a membership to support us during this critical time. It seems cliche, but every dollar really does count, and every little bit helps us. And next year, the museum will be celebrating its 15th anniversary. And we want to be able to deliver all the exciting and innovative exhibitions and programs that we have planned. So the exhibition Miniature Masterpieces would not be possible if it weren't for the generous donation of lacquerware from the private collection of Dennis H. and Marion S. Prislin. Marion, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your generosity and for allowing us to exhibit these timeless objects. And for those of you who are local and feel comfortable visiting in person, I highly encourage you to come and see the boxes. They're absolutely stunning, and they are spread throughout the galleries, and they're just beautiful, and there's really something for everyone in this exhibition. The exhibit would also not be possible if it weren't for the hard work and dedication of our intern, Erik Livingston, who spent his summer conducting in-depth research on the lacquerware. It wasn't easy for him, I'm sure. He was our first remote intern that we've ever had, but really, he worked through the translation and the research and really did a fabulous job. Erik currently attends the College of Worcester and is majoring in art history with a minor in Russian studies. So with that, I will turn it over to Erik.
Hi, so thank you for coming. Like Amy said, my name is Erik Livingston. I was a curatorial intern with the Museum of Russian Icons this summer. I spent my time researching the lacquer boxes that had recently been donated in preparation for this current exhibit. So today I'm going to walk you through a bit of the history on the boxes and show lots of pictures of them. So just to introduce myself, like I said, my name is Erik. I am from Grand Haven, Michigan. I am a junior at the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, studying art history and minoring in Russian studies. At school, I am very involved with our Russian department. I live in our Russian suite, am co-president of our Russian club, and I am also the department assistant and research assistant for our Russian department. In addition to that, I am also a music director for our school's radio station. I am incredibly passionate about Eastern European folk art as well as post-Soviet art. So this internship was kind of that sweet spot where I got to study a lot of the things I'm interested in. As noted on the previous slide, I was a curatorial intern for the museum this past summer, and I could not have had a greater time. I won't go too in depth into how precisely I spent my time, but it was a lot of looking at gorgeous images, translating inscriptions, and researching all things I love with all my heart. When I originally presented on my research at the end of the summer, I focused a lot more on the legacy of icon manufacture within these boxes, but today, on the other hand, I want to spend time discussing what lacquer boxes are, typical characteristics of the villages, and show lots more images. So what are lacquer boxes? Lacquer boxes are small papier-mâché boxes. Once they are crafted, then they're lacquered. Before that, they're generally painted, sanded, and kind of molded a little more. So lacquering is a type of finish that creates a very glossy shine on the objects. Something that is really important to note here is that while there is a market for these boxes in Russia, they have predominantly been for international sale. Here are some images of the lacquer box production process. These are Fedoskino artists, which is one of the villages where the majority of the boxes in the museum's collection originate from. I wanted to showcase these not only because they are beautiful, but because they show the detail and at times intense labor that can go into these objects. So the villages that we will be looking at are Fedesquino, Kolowi, Mstera, and Palekh. These are some of the most well-known manufacturers of lacquer boxes, as well as the villages where nearly all the boxes in the museum's collection originate from, with Fedesquino being the overwhelmingly most common. So Fedesquino is the smallest of the villages. It has a population of about 200 and is roughly an hour from Moscow. It is also the oldest of the manufacturers, with its origins being traced back to the 18th century. Kolowi has a population of about 1,000. According to an urban legend, icons have been being produced in the area since before the Mongol invasion. However, as is the case with many of these villages, the area would shift away from icon manufacture to lacquer boxes after the establishment of the USSR. Mstera is the second largest of the villages, with a population hovering between 4,000 to 5,000. The village developed around a local monastery in the 17th century, and perhaps due to this connection, began manufacturing icons. An interesting thing about icons from this village is that they are incredibly popular among Russian old believers due to their perceived austerity. And then finally, Palekh is the largest of the villages. Its population fluctuates between 5,000 to 6,000. The village has a history of icon production, but just like Kolowi and Mstera, would switch to lacquer boxes in the 1920s after the revolution, as religious art was no longer a lucrative or socially acceptable mode of expression. So now that we have established a basic history of the villages as a whole, we should move on and discuss some of the characteristics. So here's a Fedesquino box entitled Boy with Horn. Boxes from Fedesquino are typically painted with oil paint. They also use either gold leafing or metallic powders in order to create a glossy shine on the objects. Fedesquino boxes are also known for having a tortoiseshell interior. And then popular Fedesquino scenes include tea drinking, samovars, troikas, and peasant scenes. This box highlights almost all of these characteristics. We can see in particular on the leaves, a type of golden sheen that is most likely or potentially due to a metallic powder. The scene it depicts is also highly characteristic of Fedesquino, showing a peaceful and very idyllic and idealized even peasant scene. So this box is also from Fedesquino. It illustrates the folktale of Silver Hoof. This box is one of my favorites and shows typical aspects of Fedesquino design. For example, nature is more decorative, most notably trees. It also utilizes a warm color palette with the use of ochre being incredibly notable. These points can be seen clearly in the tree in the background, which is serving an almost purely decorative function. The way it bends is incredibly unique and points to its decorative nature. This can also be seen in the snow, which has piled in a way that is almost physically impossible for snow to in the physical world. And then on the house, we can also see the use of ochre, a notable continuation of Fedesquino design. So here are some additional boxes from Fedesquino. Like I mentioned earlier, the overwhelming majority of boxes in the Museum of Russian Icons' collection originate from this village. These are some of my favorites. I think they are just incredibly beautiful. These ones do a great job at showcasing the prevalence of peasant scenes on lacquer boxes. Such depictions are almost always highly idealized and very romanticized too. We can also see, particularly on the box on the far right of the woman, this kind of metallic highlighting that is very indicative of Fedesquino. So on to Kolowi. This is a box that depicts the Moscow Kremlin. A defining characteristic of Kolowi includes the use of a warm color palette that places priorities on yellows, browns, and reds. We can see the use of yellows on the top of the buildings, browns throughout the work against the buildings and the trees, and then reds on the Kremlin wall. There is also sparing use of ornamentation, and figures are depicted more realistically. These can all be seen on this box, as well as an emphasis on naturalism. So we can see that particularly in the trees, which are very realistic, very naturalistic. And we can also see this in the use of foreshortening for the walking figures, which illustrates an emphasis on a more realistic depiction of the natural world. This is another Kolwe box entitled North. It also highlights key features of the village's lacquer box characteristics. We can see the use of golds, reds, and browns throughout the work. Particularly, golds are present as a means to articulate the geese and the house. We can also see reds and browns being used on the trees. We can also view a unique feature of Kolwe design, which are swirling forms. These are typically present in clouds, water, and we can see them particularly in the clouds and in the trees in the background of this image. So here are some additional Kolwe lacquer boxes. The one on the left with the birds is one of probably my favorite actually out of them all. The colors are just so vibrant and I love the way the wings are depicted. This box allows us to see the almost unprecedented use of color by Kolwe artists. It's very vibrant and lively in a way that is distinct from the other villages. These two landscape boxes are also gorgeous and showcase the prevalence of landscapes as well as cityscapes on lacquer boxes, not only in Kolwe, but across all of the villages. So onto Mstera. This is a Mstera box entitled Spring. Typical characteristics of Mstera lacquer boxes include the use of tempera paint, the use of a warm color palette, as well as the use of depth. As well as this, they often have subtle gold framing around the edges and tend to depict figures from either reality, literature, or folklore. This work does not fit perfectly into these categories and is a bit of an outlier. Oh, excuse me. There we go. Is it a bit of an outlier in this respect? But I wanted to showcase it as I feel it does an excellent job at highlighting the color palette associated with Mstera, and that it helps to problematize that these boxes are not monolithic, nor are their villages. They are constantly evolving and experimenting with different styles, trying new things, and really growing. The artists are always growing as artists and are constantly experimenting. This box does, though, show, like I said, the color palette associated with Mstera, as well as the use of a subtle gold framing around the edges. So, onto one of the most outlier boxes out of them all. This box is entitled Mystery from a Distant Galaxy, and it is incredibly unique and seemingly defies all characteristics of Mstera design. It is an outlier compared to other Mstera boxes, specifically in that the figures are depicted with highly elongated limbs and facial features, as well as the background being less naturalistic, the opposite of what we generally see in their design. However, there are critical continuities with the general boxes associated with Mstera, as well as this box. This includes the use of a painted sky in the background, as well as the slight presence of naturalism being used to depict the animals, particularly the dog, as well as the cows in the background. I wanted to show this work because not only is it incredibly beautiful and unique, but because it highlights that lacquer boxes and their artists, just like the other box did, are constantly evolving past various histories associated with icon production or folktale inspired imagery. They're always experimenting with different styles, particularly into the 20th and 21st centuries. So we can see down here in the background an emphasis and a use of a painted sky, as well as colored backgrounds that we would generally associate with Mstera. We can also see on the dog and on the cows a inclination for naturalism, even if they are at times highly stylized. So these boxes are not from Mstera. There are unfortunately not that many boxes available. So here I'm opting to show a mix of the villages in order to showcase a typical theme, which is landscapes. So when crafting landscapes, artists generally turn to either city scenes or very idyllic rural settings like these. So these all depict churches or very small villages, generally in the woods or against a river. These depictions are generally highly romanticized and they showcase an idealized vision of country life. So onto Palekh. This is a Palekh box entitled Troika, and it depicts a troika, surprisingly enough. Boxes from this village utilize tempera paint, often have golden shading, and employ very delicate design. The figures also tend to be very elongated. So some of the features that are common on Palekh boxes, but that we don't see here, is the deployment of very decorative backgrounds and an emphasis on architecture. Popular scenes from Palekh generally include figures from reality, song, and fantasy. On this box, we can see many of these characteristics, even if some are not present. So for example, on this area of the horse, we can see the use of subtle gold shading around the muscles of the horse as well as the bends in its neck. We can also see that the figures in the troika are handled very delicately and often very softly, which is another staple of Palekh design. So while the figures in this work do not appear very elongated, we can see traces of this still in the horses, particularly in their legs. So this is another Palekh box entitled The Little Humpbacked Horse, which is based on a poem by Pyotr Pavlovich. This box shows many of the characteristics associated with Palekh design. Perhaps the most notable in the work is its fine linearity and low horizon line. Even though architecture is not the focus of this work, it is still emphasized in a very significant way. This work also utilizes a red and gold color palette, which can be seen here, particularly against the ground in these very deep golden ochre tones, as well as on the houses. And we can also see a inclination towards architecture and still a delicate hand in depicting it, even if it is not the focus of the work. So these Palekh boxes are just spectacular in my opinion. I love these so much. I am completely in love with the butterflies, bugs, and birds on the side of the left box. The entirety is like that, except the front as well as the back have these angels on them, and it is just so detailed and really wonderful to look at. Its decorative landscape is very indicative of Palekh, which is really interesting to see how these boxes are still utilizing characteristics that we generally see in the early days of their boxes and in the mid 20th century being continued into the 21st and late 20th century. I also love the religious box on the right. It is just completely gorgeous. The contrast between the reds and the greens is really beautiful to look at. It is much more traditional and harkens back to icons in a much more pointed fashion than some of the other boxes we have looked at. It is just, yeah, these are just fantastic in my opinion, and I could stare at these all day. So to kind of pull things back together and leave you with some final points on these. So we really can see persistent characteristics from village to village that are consistent, even if they are evolving and growing as the years go by. So while they are drawing on shared vocabularies from across all these villages, that is not to say that these boxes and their artists are not open to experimentation. As we saw particularly with the Mstera box, artists in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have begun to experiment much more heavily with humans in particular, as well as just the overall design. These artists are generally moving away from characteristics we would typically associate with icons as well as folk-inspired designs contemporary artists are tending to favor more modern designs, specifically in regards to humans, as I mentioned earlier. While these boxes are truly just a visual feast, to say the least, and are just incredibly beautiful objects, there is also a very palpable academic value to them. So these objects really allow us to highlight the artistic reaction not only to the establishment of the USSR, as we see all of these icon centers shifting to secular works that were more lucrative as well as socially acceptable during this period, but we can also see how artists in today's post-Soviet world are redefining their medium, their subject matter, and just their careers as a whole. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, I would love to hear them or answer them. So thank you.
Thank you, Erik. So we have a couple questions coming in. So why is papier-mâché the material of choice? Did you come across that at all in your research?
That's a fantastic question. I believe just because it is so light, I would imagine. I can't think of, there's no like smoking gun answer. I don't think so. But I think it's just, they're just really light. It's easier to work with, even if it is tedious at times. And it probably goes very well with lacquering as a whole, and just in the end will probably look just very shiny because it is very light and not dense. That's what I would say.
Let's see, what other questions? How do they get that pearl-like look, the pearlescent sheen?
Yeah, that is the lacquering. That is the shine that is there. It is just, I can't speak to the chemistry of it, unfortunately. I am not good at chemistry, and even if I wish I was, I don't know all the ins and outs, but it's something in its density, I would imagine. It's just very reflective. It's a very reflective material. It plays with light really well. So that is really how it gets that kind of pearl shine to it.
And from my understanding, it's really layer upon layer of lacquer. So it's not just one final coat that they put on. It's you can look on YouTube for videos of how they do it. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, there are like so many awesome videos of this that I remember looking at when I was researching them. So if anyone is curious on how they're made, I really recommend that.
Great. And so these next two questions are somewhat related. So can these boxes be traced back to a specific artist? Are they typically signed? As we know with icons, most icons are not signed. And is there a way of dating them?
Yes, I would say so. These can almost all be traced back to an artist. Generally, I would say more into the 21st century and late 20th, as artists are experimenting more. They are very much certain styles are popping up much more that are not specific of a whole village, but of normally individual people. And I don't know if I can zoom in. Oh, I can. So if you can see right here, there we go. Sorry, my screen is freaking out a little, but so on this box down here, we can see the artist's signature on the right. First it says Fedoskino, so that's how we know it is from Fedoskino. And then it says, if I can read that right, Rogatov Sosta. So that would be, Rogatov CC is the artist. The majority of these boxes are signed. Go back. Some of the signatures are really hard to read and are basically illegible if you are not a native Russian speaker. So that was fun for me to deal with. But almost all of them are signed. If not, these villages generally have records of their artists and of what they have done. And there are many websites dedicated to the villages that will actually have like indexes of all the artists. So that is a way where you can really match the design to the artist. I believe I did that a few times where I was just said like, hey, this box looks a lot like this artist that we have a lot of. But I would say there is also probably like a chemical way of dating these. But I would also say more generally, that the subject matter being shown on these is a great way to date them. So for example, there's one box that has an image of Lenin, and I believe it is from like the mid 1970s. We probably wouldn't see that now. And we also would not have seen the Mystery from a Distant Galaxy in the mid 20th century. So these subject matters are also really key for dating them, is what I would say. So yeah, I think that was all the question.
No, that was great. Typically, how long does it take to make one of these boxes? Obviously, it would depend on the size, but on average, what were we looking at?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's dependent on, I would imagine, the size and the complexity of the design. So something like this one right here, this Adam and Eve box, I would say like if the artist was working just continuously on this box the entire time, maybe a week or two, but it's probably a little longer than that just because they're probably switching between projects, but there are also very simple ones. So one of the earlier boxes that had the birds on it, which was just more simple, would probably be about a week or a week and a half. It's probably very dependent on how much the artist is juggling themselves, how much they, if they're at a time crunch, I would imagine. It's very dependent on complexity, size, but I would imagine about a week and a half to 3 weeks is my final answer.
Great. And then I don't know if this came up in your research because I know you were looking at, historically, but today when the boxes are produced, is there more of an emphasis on the school of design or the individual artist? I guess which is preferred when purchasing a lacquer box?
I think I would say the Village still has a great deal of sway in the name because it is a type of brand essentially. So like they will all have, I don't have any pictures up here, but the majority of boxes, at least the Fedescino boxes, generally have a stamp in the inside or some inscription that says like Fedescino. So it is authorized as a Fedescino box. So the brand is still very important. I think that probably supersedes the artists themselves. Like there are most likely very sought after individual artists. But I think overall it is like the Village themselves that is the mark of like the status symbol of it all.
Great. Well, I think that's it for questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Erik, for your presentation. And this is being recorded, so it'll be available on our website by the end of the week, if not early next week. And everyone who is registered today will receive a link to the recording. So you can be on the lookout for that. And like I said, if you're local, please give us a visit. We're open by appointment, and it's really just a stunning exhibition. So thank you, everyone.